Okay, I hope you can keep yourselves warm. Swing your arms. That's what I used to do out in the orchards. Orchards are planted with good air drainage. So you're out on the hills with orchards. And I used to prune them during the winter time, and sometimes it would get cold out there. And this is up in Connecticut, and we'd be swinging those arms and kicking those legs. It really brings the blood into the hands and stuff. But I can't go like this with this hand, so it gets cold. Okay, so this talk is environmental responsibility. Now we have two stories to choose from. To choose from about the origin of our food supply. The evolution story, that we went around like apes and baboons searching for food, or that God gave us a garden homestead, Genesis 2:8, with very good food, Genesis 1:29 and 1:31, and that we were to keep it that way, Genesis 2:15. God would water it, Genesis 2:6, and we were to serve the ground and the garden. That's Genesis 2:5, and the garden, Genesis 2:15. Now, the evolution story does not carry with it any responsibility or obligation to care for our environment. We're to just struggle and fight for whatever's there, and the strongest fighter will survive. The creation story tells us that we were given a work of service to the ground, to abad the ground, to till the ground, and a work of service to the garden. We were to maintain an environment that was delightfully pleasant but delicately designed. Remember the definition of Eden. The word Eden in Hebrew means pleasure, delicate, and delight. Genesis 2:8 and 9 says, "And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that's pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." So every tree in this garden homestead was either designed for beauty or food or for both. This environment was designed to be a pleasant and delightful one, but it was delicately designed. It needed our careful service to the ground, Genesis 2:5, as we planted God's design garden, and was to be kept his way. This is Genesis 2:15. The creation story fits hand in glove with our planet home's need of upkeep. If we're to be healthy and have food in abundance in a delightful environment, we have to do things God's way. Now, how many like mosquitoes? Will mosquitoes be in heaven? Mosquitoes, the female is the only one that bites. And the reason the female bites is because they were designed as hummingbirds to pollinate flowers. Mosquitoes pollinate tiny flowers. And as a hummingbird and as a honeybee, they go to the flowers to get nectar. And they suck nectar. And when the female cannot get sufficient mineral content from the nectar because we've damaged the soil, then it borrows some from people or animals. If you want no mosquito in heaven, we will have mosquitoes, but they will not need to borrow because we haven't damaged the soil there. We'll be maintaining it. We'll be doing our jobs the way they should be done. Okay, so the evolution story says we just need to fight harder to kill off everything that's trying to interfere with our needs. Today we use poisons on our food, insecticides, fungicides, bactericides, virucides, herbicides, rodenticides, bird deterrent chemicals on our berries to win the war against nature. Harsh chemicals in conventional agriculture and mild chemicals in organic agriculture. Now the book Education page 22 says, "The Garden of Eden was a representation of what God desired the whole earth to become. And it was his purpose that as the human family increased in numbers, they should establish other homes and schools where the words and the works of God should be studied, and where the students, that's us, should thus be fitted more and more fully to reflect throughout endless ages the light of the knowledge of God's glory." Now, do you think God designed us to live a life of struggle, fighting, and killing? Now, do you think we can become allergic to these weapons of war that we use against nature? Our war against nature stems from the evolution story. Instead of the creation story, where a creator gave us a paradise that we were responsible to keep up. Evolution's foundation that competition, fighting, and killing will give us a better life is not from God. Think of that when you get out your sprays. To spray something. It is ignorance of creation's design. I remember one of the kids on the bus once at the academy I was teaching at. He fooled the other kids by running over and catching with his hands a wasp, and everyone thought, "Oh, you're going to get stung." But he knew better. That wasp doesn't have a stinger. That's species. So we need to understand things and not be slaughtering everything around us. Now, it is ignorance of creation's design so it's ignorance of our roles of service to keep it a paradise. The creation story also says in Genesis 2:9 that we were given a tree of life, not a tree of death, fighting, struggling, and killing to live. A tree of life and a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, good and evil in Hebrew, Tav and Ra, are two words that imply functional and dysfunctional. The operation of God's design can function as a paradise or dysfunction into a struggle for food, habitat, competition for mates. We were given the opportunity to know only how our paradise homestead could function for good, but that requires our effort to keep it that way. Genesis 2:4 begins, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created." Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." Now, this is the beginning of the history of the growth on earth. Genesis 2:5 says, "And every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew." No growth had occurred yet, for the Lord had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. Now, what does tilling or killing the plants or herbs of the field so we can have bare ground have to do with creation's design for mankind? Abed, the Hebrew word for till, means a work of service. We were to serve the ground, plants, and the herbs. We were made to serve the environment of creation to keep it a paradise. Now, we had an environmental responsibility to understand the creation design so we could assist its growth. We were created to be servants of the plants that fed our life, fed all life. Now, why servants? Because God's character is that of a servant. That's why we were to abad the ground and to abad the garden. Nature is a lesson book about God. In the book Education, in the section entitled The Eden School, it begins, "The system of education instituted at the beginning of the world was to be a model for man throughout all after time. As an illustration of its principles, a model school was established in Eden, the home of our first parents. The Garden of Eden was the schoolroom. Nature was the lesson book. The Creator himself was the instructor, and the parents of the human family were the students." It also says, "To Adam and Eve was committed the care of the garden, to dress it and to keep it," Genesis 2:15. "Though rich in all that the owner of the universe could supply, they were not to be idle. Useful occupation was appointed them as a blessing to strengthen the body, to expand the mind, and to develop the character." End quote. Our responsibility to keep earth a paradise develops the character of God in us. How can you do that job and keep it a paradise without conducting the jobs of service you were given. It's a training in the character of Christ. Our responsibility to keep earth a paradise develops the character of God in us, as well as strengthen our body, expand our minds, our understanding of creation's design. Now, two things were needed for creation's design to begin to grow and function: water and mankind serving the plants. In Genesis 2:6, God watered it with a mist. In Genesis 2:7, he made man to serve it. In 2:8, the Lord God said he planted a garden. A garden is a designed planting. We have flower gardens, vegetable gardens, herb gardens, vineyards, orchards, groves. God planted a garden for us east of where God made Adam and Eve. It was a land called Eden. Eden means pleasure, delicate, and delight. In the land of pleasure and delight, God planted a garden for the first family. He put them there to serve it. It was a delicate design, but mankind had been made to keep it a paradise. God would water it, and we would keep it up. We were the groundskeepers. This homestead was to be duplicated as the human family grew in numbers until these garden homesteads filled the entire earth. Remember what I read you about in Education, page 22. The Garden of Eden was a representation of what God desired the whole earth to become. And it was his purpose that as the human family increased in numbers, they should establish other homes and schools. And why is it called a school? It's a training ground in service. This occupation builds the character of God in us. We are serving the garden plants that we will eat. Now it continues, thus in course of time the whole earth might be occupied with homes and schools where the words and the works of God should be studied. There was no Bible when it says the words of God. We read before that nature's voice is a voice of Christ, teaching us innumerable lessons of love and power and submission and perseverance. It continues, some do not appreciate the value of agricultural work. These should not plan for our schools, for they will hold everything from advancing in right lines. In the past, their influence has been a hindrance, end quote. And this was from, Testimony, Volume 6, page 178. In Education, page 20, it says, the system of education instituted at the beginning of the world was to be a model for man throughout all after time. As an illustration of its principles, a model school was established in Eden, the home of our first parents. The Garden of Eden was the schoolroom, nature was the lesson book, the Creator himself was the instructor, and the parents of the human family were the students. And it continues, created to be the image and glory of God, 1 Corinthians 11:7, Adam and Eve had received endowments not unworthy of their high destiny. They were endowed with high mental and spiritual gifts that they might not only discern the wonders of the visible universe, but comprehend moral responsibilities and obligations. What do you think these moral responsibilities and obligations were? I'm trying to impress you with the need to get back to taking care of the earth. I mean, if we're going to make the Pope look bad, how better to make him look bad when he says, trash it 6 days, but rest on Sunday? How better to make him look bad than to redeem the planet and make it look like Eden again? And Israel was guided to do it. How about we do it? So we make him look like a fool to anyone who listens to his talk. Anyway. In Education, page 196, it tells us, the youth should be taught that the laws of nature are the laws of God, as truly divine as are the precepts of the Decalogue. Did you get that? The youth should be taught that the laws of nature are the laws of God, as truly divine as are the precepts of the Decalogue. We teach the kids to obey the Ten Commandments. Do we teach them that? This quote was in regard to keeping our bodies according to God's design. Do you think it stops with our bodies? How about the earth and its environment? Now in Education, page 21, it tells us to Adam and Eve was committed the care of the garden, just like we were committed to care of our bodies, to dress it and to keep it. She quotes Genesis 2:15. Though rich in all that the owner of the universe could supply, they, Adam and Eve, were not to be idle. Useful occupation was appointed them as a blessing. So God provided the rain and man to keep the paradise growing as a paradise, and he gave us bodies to keep healthy and happy also. Useful occupation was appointed them as a blessing to strengthen the body, expand the mind, and develop the character. Don't forget that part, to develop the character. It also says the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden. Remember, Eden is pleasure and delight, but delicate. And there in Eden, he put the man whom he had formed, and out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, Genesis 2:8 and 9. Here amidst the beautiful scenes of nature, untouched by sin, our first parents were to receive their education. Now, do you think that since sin has entered creation, that the book of nature can no longer teach us about God? I've heard some people say that. In Desire of Ages, it says, page 20, in the beginning God was revealed in all the works of creation. And upon all things in earth and air and sky, he wrote the message of the Father's love. Now remember, his love, his power, the need to submit to it and to persevere in following it. It continues. Now sin has marred God's perfect work, yet that handwriting remains. Even now, all created things declare the glory of his excellence. There's nothing save the selfish heart of man that lives to itself. Then Ellen White gives examples of the blessings that we receive. Now, is it because of selfishness that we don't take upon ourselves the upkeep of the piece of earth we live on? We got to ask ourselves that question. The Pope calls Earth a planet home. And how do you keep up your house? Or do you think, like I have heard Adventists say, it's all going to burn anyways? I hope we're not in that camp. Our responsibility to keep our homestead functioning as God designed it to be a paradise is our schooling in the development of the character of Christ in us. And do we need that schooling? 180 years saying that he's coming soon, that's not the definition of soon I know. In Christ's Object Lessons, page 69, it says, when the character of Christ shall be perfectly reproduced in his people, then he will come to claim them as his own. That's a lot more than just evangelistic efforts must be conducted around the earth. It is the privilege of every Christian not only to look for his coming, but to hasten the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. And she quotes 2 Peter 3:12 margin. We're all who profess his name bearing fruit to his glory, how quickly the whole world would be sown with the seed of the gospel. Quickly the last great harvest would be ripened, and Christ would come to gather the precious grain. End quote. Now, we're morally responsible for Earth's upkeep. But how? Now, this brings us back to what story do you believe? Evolution or creation? Belief is not what you think in your mind. Your belief is what your daily activities are. The evolution story does not carry with it any responsibility or obligation to care for our environment. We just struggle and fight against the weeds and the insects and the diseases and the invasive plants and the animals that want to eat our crops. So what's your belief? Now, where is design? Where is the design that we can work at that will reestablish Eden's pleasant and delightful environment? Abundant food and abundant habitat and healthy mates for all life. We were given by God a designed garden to duplicate until we filled the whole earth with them. Every family was to work on their piece of ground. Ministry of Healing 183 and 184. That's with God's plan for Israel. Earth can be restored homestead after homestead when each family follows God's design. Just look at all the ladies in Ethiopia there. 6,000 of them. It was one region. They're all living there. Homestead after homestead. They replanted those shrubs. And then their springs began to flow. And their creeks began to flow again. Okay. Every family was to work on their piece of ground. Now, God designed companion planting. When we view in nature, we call it an ecosystem. My ecosystems where I live are Chestnut Oak Ridge, Red Maple Swamp, Cattail Marsh, a hayfield, an orchard, a food forest, a vineyard, a kiwi arbor, and many gardens. Some are natural, like, the Chestnut Oak Ridge. You have a white oak and chestnut oak ridge here, according to the leaves on the ground. Companion plants operate in God's design to maintain themselves until we damage them. When we damage or change the environment to an ecosystem, invasive plants come in to repair the environment. You've heard of invasive plants? They will restore its function once again as God designed. I have a book that's called Invasive Plant Medicine: The Ecological Benefits and Healing Abilities of Invasives. So invasive plants are the best plant for the most rapid healing of the damage we have done to the soil. That's why they're coming in. And that's why they see them. And they're not going to grow well in this environment. Number one, the mycorrhizal and all the other microbes in the soil are designed to support this forest. They're not going to support the invasives. We have to trash it first. Get a bulldozer, does a nice job trashing it. And then the invasives come in because they have to repair it. They're the repairers. This is what this pampas grass is. I've been down here, but I haven't been down here in years. And now I see this pampas grass all over, and it's not just planted anymore. It's coming in. But in Brazil, what do? Burn down the forest, against the law, but they do it anyways. Plant commercial crops, soybeans, corn, sugarcane. Wear the soil out in no time at all because it's exposed to the sun and it's too hot down there to do that. Then they have grass come up and they feed cattle on it. The cattle overgraze it, and then nothing will grow on it except pampas grass, clump grass, what they call it down there. But there are people that come in and they plant trees that will grow in that harsh environment in rows, put plantain, bananas, papaya rows down between those trees, give them each enough sunlight, and then use them as mulch and rebuild the soil around their plants. And they restore the landscape. But we got to remember, in the tropics, you can feed with decaying materials, but you're not going to reestablish the soil with humus because it's the tropics. You go as far north as Scotland and you have heather because they cut down all the forests, and the only thing that comes back is heather. And then forests can't grow again, and you have to plow downhill to create erosion to wash away the excessive topsoil so that the pine seeds can germinate on that soil. Each environment has its own conditions. So down in the tropics, it's biochar. The natives cut down the forests, and there were approximately 100 million natives in the Amazonian basin when we first came here to visit. When we came back 30 years later, there was only about 5 million left. We brought diseases. The whole East Coast, native populations, 90% or more were wiped out. When the Pilgrims landed, they planted in cornfields. The village had left. What few members were there after the diseases swept through that we were immune to, that they had problems with. So the invasive plants are repairers of the ecosystem. So why do weeds grow better than our garden plants? Two reasons. The weed seeds have a microbiome inside them. Weed seeds have a microbiome in them. There are up to 10,000 species of microbes living, that have been recorded, living in seeds and on seeds. This is God's design. We're going to be getting deeper into this. And weeds have a microbiome designed to live in the ground's environment. This is why the invasives do best. The environment we have made. Now, weeds grow better in damaged soil, worn out soil, than garden seeds. Weeds are God's repairers of the soil. There's books on that. There's a book Charles Walters Jr. put out, Weeds Control Without Poisons. And basically it teaches you why they're there. And my wife likes to take pictures of little girls sitting in daisies. And so we had a nice patch of daisy in our orchard. But I know what those daisies mean. Daisies mean we don't have enough calcium in that ground. Okay, and so we're not going to have a good sugar content of those apples. So I go and lime the ground. The daisies go away because they're repairing the soil by adding calcium to it, and when I do the job, they don't have to do it anymore. So this is what farmers are learning, how to repair things and take over. You know, God has a template. He's showing us. This curse here is because now this is how you repair it. So this is what we're learning. Examples of damaged soil are compaction. I noticed I started no-till in my tomato patch, and the way to operate a no-till is to keep something growing on the ground all the time. So in the spring, this is just the latter part of the year. I haven't figured out the first part of the year yet, although I put in white clover, which will start very early. It'll start feeding the microbes in April and even March. But the geese came in and ate it all off, so we've got to re-establish it again. But in July, I come into the tomato patch, get the weed eater, scalp the ground, make sure I scuff up dirt, and then come in with tillage radishes, daikon radishes, you know, big long ones with the roots and stuff. And I've been doing this for 3 years now, and normally they come down about 6 inches, but I noticed this year they're sizing up to coming down into the earth 8 inches. They're tilling the ground for me. This is the type of tillage we need to be doing. If the ground's compacted, we need to till it, but we don't need to destroy the plant cover in the process of doing it. We need to use the brassicas. We'll get more into the different plant species later. So for imbalanced fertilization, we want to, one of the biggest problems, they say the biggest problem in agriculture is compaction, but another one that almost equals that now is imbalanced soil, excessive fertilization in the soil. And so it's imbalanced. And so when we establish these cover crops, they will only make available the minerals and nutrients that need to be available, and those that are in excess, they won't make available. Their genes for doing that will shut off. Now, we need organic matter. So this is why you have a lot of biomass. You see big weeds, for instance, giant ragweed. You know, it's replacing potassium and organic matter that's missing. So, and then we also have antibiotic overload, which is, you know what the most used antibiotic on earth is? Roundup. Roundup was developed as an antibiotic. It's the most used antibiotic on earth because it's an herbicide also. So we have, well, Roundup contamination is so prominent that 95, and this was years back, 95% of the people tested were urinating Roundup. Okay, glyphosate. We have drainage problems. Soils have to be able to breathe. So these are some of our responsibilities we have to do. Soils have to be able to breathe. We can't have this compaction. I gave you examples about what they did to open the soil up so it can breathe again. Just reestablishing the ecosystem with wolves was an example of opening the soil up. What the women did, planting those trees. opens the soil up again. We can not only open the soil up again by growing specific crops that we're going to plant our crops with. We can open, well, I forgot what I was going to say. We can open the soil. Oh, those crops not only help to open the soil up, but there are certain ones that are used for cover crops that are called reductive. They reduce. Reduction is the process of removing oxygen molecules from minerals. They have oxidized. It's a natural process God designed to, instead of let the minerals all wash away, oxidize them. And then they're still in the soil as rust. You know, oxidized iron is rust. But even though the plant can take up rust, plant can't use rust. And it will have an iron deficiency full of rust in it. But the soil microbes, these reductive plants, they can take the oxygen off. They can take the oxygen off of zinc and manganese and cobalt and all these different other minerals they need. They can take the oxygen off of potassium and make it available. So this is why we want to have plants that support these microbes. And they're constantly making fertilizer in the ground we grow our tomatoes in. You know, if I have the white clover in there, productive, it's doing that. And I put my tomatoes in it. Tomatoes grow taller, no problem. And by the time July rolls around, my tomatoes are up like this in the cages, and I scalp the ground in between them, put in the daikons, because that ground is bulldoze ground, compacted, and I need to loosen it up. So I'm having them work. So we use these plants to redeem the earth around us. So we got to, when ground is shaded, you got to give sunlight. You know, I was just pointing out some trees, the dentist there, that need to come down in his orchard, around his orchard. You know, you need the light. And if you're in the tropics, you need the palms. There's a permaculture design that's taught in the wet tropics where you take a shovel and you dig and you throw the dirt out as far as you can. And it makes a mound about 30 feet around. And in the wet center now, because it's the wet tropics, you plant your, well, we're mostly English, taro, dasheen, cocoa, yautía if you're Spanish. Dasheen and cocoa is for or idos if you're the islanders, or Jamaican, you know, and stuff. Because it grows in the wetter ground. And then on the drier ground coming up, you plant your vegetables so the roots can get in and get the water they need. And then on the highest, driest ground, you put sweet potatoes. But it's too much sun. So you plant plantain around it, and you face the rhizomes in one direction so they march around the circle, you know, because that's the way they grow. And then on the outside of the ring, you put coconut, because that's the design God made for the tropics. You get the palms. They're the ones that help cut that sunlight down. Then you get more photosynthesis going on, more fruit production going on, because you're operating using God's design. And so ground that's left uncovered, you know, I fly over in the airplane coming in, and I'm looking out at all the farmland. You know how many farmlands are uncovered? That's the rain is beating on it, the flocculated soil is mashing, the sun's baking it. You know, that's not good germination ground. Then they got to come in with heavy equipment, because now it's baked hard, and of course that compacts it more, to bust it up and go over it more times in order to loosen it and make a seed bed to start in the spring. No, you keep plants growing on it, and you grow plants together. What does an ecosystem like this comprise? You look at it around you here, you can probably get 20, 30 species, maybe 40 species. And they work synergistically all together. Every plant is feeding different microbes, and these microbes are repairing, or I should say, feeding the plant. And they're feeding one another. The whole system is working one with another. So, okay, so, Now, when we change the ground's habitat, its environment, microbe populations change. Now, what happens when microbe populations change? Genetic changes occur in the plants. Endophytes change and alter genetics. Endophytes are microbes that the plants have engulfed. The word is engulf, not eat. They just open up and say, come on in. And then they go into the plant and they go through the vascular system and they go to the leaves and stems and fruit and flowers. And these endophytes take over and become the genes for the plant. Okay? We think genes is like a blueprint. I mean, that's what we're all taught. Not so anymore. We know that endophytes, they call them bots when somebody's using them wrong, you know, like putting it in a vaccine, you know, so that they can have endo whatevers. I don't know what you call them. Doctor, do you know what they call microbes that live inside cells that alter the genetics? Do they have a name for it? Endo means inside and phytes means plant. So it would be endo something or other, that they live in the plants and take over the genetics, or live in the person and take over the genetics of the cell. Okay, well, I'm trying to learn these terms, but some of them aren't even established yet. So, but anyways, in the plant kingdom, they're called endophytes. And plants will rhizophagy, rhizo meaning root, phagy meaning phagocytosis. They will engulf microbes and take them into the cells. They will take bacteria, they will take fungus. This has all been reported by Dr. James White, a professor at Rutgers, and they will take in algae. Matter of fact, the world record for, the U.S. record for corn production was broken last year in Hickory, North Carolina, because they fed the corn green algae. Corn has a capability of producing, and I think they got like 450, 60 some odd bushels per acre, which broke the record. But anyways, it was using these endophytes. So we have the mycorrhizal fungi. We've probably all heard about them. You know, these fungus that go out and create highway systems in the soil. And with internet, so that the plant can send out the signals of what they want, how much they want. And then they mine and send the minerals back to the plant and stop along the way if they've been requested at the bacterial colonies that are manufacturing nutrients, we use that term, nutrients for the plant. And so these operations, and then the bacteria, inside bacteria do all kinds of things. In the rhizophagy, when it takes in bacterias that have been feeding upon fungus, these bacteria, when they come inside, they're engulfed by the plant root. When they come inside the plant, they are sprayed or whatever with a solution that digests their outside coating. They release their nutrients, and then the environment is so pleasant inside, they reproduce themselves. And then they're carried by the plant to the roots, where in the roots they go down the root hairs. As a matter of fact, they even initiate root hair production and go out into the soil of the advancing roots and inoculate it, and then feed again. But if that system is not in operation, then the fungus whom they're supposed to feed upon before they enter, when they enter the plant, they're pathogenic. Root rots, Pythium, Rhizoctonium, on and on. But if they've been fed upon by the bacteria, when they enter the plant, they're beneficial. That's why farmers are encouraged, don't put fungicides and kill your fungus, because you need them in a beneficial form. But you have to alter the environment. You have to inoculate your seed so you can have the right microbes in there. So these are some of the things. So plants are symbiotic. They feed each other and they share microbe exudates. Not only are the microbes doing this operation, but the plants are exuding constantly into the soil these sugars. Healthy plants exude more of the sugars that they produce through photosynthesis into the soil to feed the microbe population there. And not only the microbe population that's going to feed them, like the, mycorrhizal fungi and the bacterial colonies that they get food from, but they feed the bacteria that flocculate the soil. In other words, make the soil aerated so it's a better environment for everybody. So this is what they do. Plants request the diet they need from these microbes by feeding microbes that will make that diet that they need. So there are like 50 to 100,000 different species of microbes in the soil, and so the plant has 50 to 100,000 different diets that it can feed into the soil to increase the colony of the microbes to give them the nutrients they need. And it's a rapid process because microbe lifespan is only 20 minutes. So when they want to increase it, they just pour out the food, those populations increase, give them all that they want, because the plant has requested a specific amount via feeding these microbes as to how much of that want. And then when they don't need it, for instance, they need certain minerals for vegetative reproduction. You've got to grow the corn stalk before you can grow the ear and the tassel, right? So they'll request certain nutrients for vegetative growth, and then they'll switch over and request certain nutrients for seed and fruit production. So they vary their requests throughout the season, throughout the growing season. And okay, so they request the diet, and then plants, they need the shade in the tropics. I've talked about that. And when you have drainage problems in the soil, you can use the tillage radish, but roots are there to create drainage. That's why you want to keep roots in the ground all the time. Now that doesn't mean when you got a pretty rough system going that you don't till the ground to start with and then start putting, I'm going to have to do something to till the ground if I can't get the clover to take in my tomato patch. I want that clover in there too. If I have too much vegetative growth that it's not going to take off, then I'll till in there to get the clover going, to get then put the tomatoes in using and growing them with a decay system, mulch, and that helps cover the ground. And then I'll till it in July when I put in the radishes, but it may be open enough to sow because the radishes die off in the wintertime. And so that's going to leave exposed ground, so I may be able to just sow with clover and see what happens, see if I can get it to go enough, So this is God's design. This is working with His design. And, okay. And then I told you about plants aerate the soil. Now, what we do to the ground determines what plants can live there, what microbes they have. Microbes in God's design feed plants. And here is the big one. They are plants' genetics. And I told you a little bit about the genetics. The endophytes that come in and alter the plant. Now, Native Americans are our professors. So are all of the poor of the world. They may be ashamed, the poor, but don't let it bother you. They don't want to tell you what they're doing because they can't afford fertilizer, they can't afford seed, and they have to save their own seed, and they have to get the plants to grow however they can, which is God's design. We have in the Southwest, you have toxic soils, alkaline salts, your alkalis, and you have drought conditions. And there are plants that grow wonderfully in that soil. And the Native Americans have learned you take those plants, crush the stems, roots, add a little water to it, put your seed in it, and the endophytes will transfer into your seed. Remember, seeds have been recorded to have in them up to 10,000 different species of microbes. Okay? And the classification of microbes is not like the classification of plants where you classify them by shapes and this and that. Even though we have some old stuff doing that, they say Borrelia is a spirochete or something like that. Classification of microbes today is what DNA they have. Okay, that's how they classify them now, is their DNA. And so you have this DNA from these native plants, and I call it put on their walking shoes, and they morph, change, and leave the plant that you've crushed, and they go into the seed. And now they become the genetics of the seed, and now that corn seed of the Native American has toxic alkali resistance and drought resistance. They got it from the microbes of those plants there. The Iroquois were doing the same thing, except they have a different situation. They have colder climates, wetter conditions, and so they take grasses that would grow really well, do the same thing, crush them up to roots and whatnot, and soak the seed in it, and they would get those endophytes to go into them, so they'd produce really well. And so, so this sort of is that technology that God designed that's being used today to do bad things with. Okay? In vaccines and stuff, putting stuff that will make you sicker, not make you better. You can use it both ways. It's like GMOs. God designed genetic modification. I was hoping to find a goldenrod stem. The goldenrod stems. Do you ever see them with the bulbs in them? Or an oak gall, an oak leaf, flat surface, but then a big bulbous gall on it? Who genetically modified it to form a round circle or on the stem? The little creatures did. So according to the textbook for the University of Connecticut, they said that they learned how to genetically modify by studying crown gall. Okay? And so this is God's design. Genetic modification is God's design. He made it, and it's designed probably as a redemptive thing because, I don't know. We'll see in heaven. Okay. But anyways, you can use it for bad, obviously. Okay? Genetically modify it so it's Roundup ready to take a whopping dose of Roundup and not die. Roundup and not die. So this is okay. So this is what we have here. I went over the endophytes here. So I talked about the beneficial pathogens. They depend on how we keep the ground. It all depends upon our responsibility. That's what this talk is right now. It's our responsibility. A microbe isn't good or bad. It can be beneficial if we keep the environment it lives in, because remember, environment is epigenetic, alters the behavior, which is a genetic thing. And if we live it God's way, if we don't do it His way, we can have problems. Now, microbes change forms rapidly. I told you how they evolve in fish. The scales over its eyes, these blind cave fish, within 3 generations, they have their eyes fully formed again. They evolve that fast. But what do they evolve from? The original genetic design. Citrus can be all kinds, right? Pomelos, kumquats, as well as oranges, grapefruit, lime, and that kind of stuff. But they're all citrus, okay? An apple's an apple, and it's got thousands of varieties, but it's still an apple, okay? The kinds don't evolve. That's a bunch of fairy tales. But everything evolves. and it evolves rapidly according to its environment. Well, we want to evolve into the character of Christ Jesus. Environment is significant. This is where we've lost it as Adventists. We're spinning our wheels for 180 years because we will not accept that environment alters behavior. So God in His mercy has come out with this knowledge in the last, 10, 20 years. We just didn't trust Him enough, but we trust science. I mean, look at our medical industry amongst Adventists. How many are trusting science above God and what He says? So, God's using science to show us, look, do what I say. You guys have been here a long time. And I've been waiting for the character of Christ to be perfectly formed in you. So, okay. Now, there are 10 times more bacterial cells in the human body than there are human cells. And there's 100 times more genetic material in our cells that is not human than there is human genes running our cells. All this other creatures in us are running our body. So we need to understand this system and how it operates, because these things manifest themselves in our behavior. They're running us a certain way. Okay, so let's okay. Now, all genetic material is influenced by the environment around it. We control the environment. We have dominion of Earth. We evolve genetic material for good or for evil. Okay? And by how we maintain the environment, or by how we alter the environment. So we've got to learn what God's environment is, and we have to start caring for our ecosystems we live in according to the design. I gave you examples in the tropics. You got a different design. You got to have the palms up top. This environment here is different. You want to build the organic matter content in the soil. It'll hold up to about 3% organic matter here, but as you go farther north, you got to get rid of the excess because of how God has designed creation. When the soil temperature falls below 55 degrees, decomposition results in fulvic acid production, which the microbes use to make a humus that is short term. A few years, a friend of mine said, I put leaves on and grass clippings on the garden, and it doesn't increase the organic matter content at all. I mulch with it every year, and it doesn't increase it. And he's a nurseryman, his family's nurseryman, so they know how to observe. But when the soil temperature is below 55 degrees, then it decays into humic acid, which creates a humus that will last hundreds of years. Hence the colder climates, deep humus layers. You got to get rid of the excess to get a forest to grow back again. Okay, and Wisconsin will hold about 4% organic matter. Down here 3%, going to Texas 2%, and Florida, tip of Florida, and tip of Texas down there, and hardly 1% it'll hold. So I know friends in Florida, in southern Florida, and they're trying to, they're organic gardeners. So I'm going to, working like crazy trying to increase the organic matter content. No, it isn't going to stay. It isn't going to stay. You've got to understand the design and be using biochar down there. And you can, you up here you're sort of in a half-half situation. You benefit with some biochar and you benefit with decay in the winter. What I do is, I used to collect the leaves that the city people bagged up, put out for the city to take away. I'd come and grab them, and get truckloads of them, put them out, and then I'd spread the leaves out in the orchard. Didn't do too much. because it's summer decay. So I got smart, left them in the bags. And so you get this whopping pile of them. And so most of the decay goes on in the wintertime. Now I'm getting organic matter content. So when you really want to add organic matter content around here, get your decay operation in the wintertime. That's God's design. He has different microbes doing different jobs at different temperatures, as well as different species of plants and all that stuff. So, there's a magazine that it's from Acres USA. It's called Epic Epigenetics, and there's one of the articles in there. Well, there's two articles in there on rebuilding the soil, and one farmer, he has instead of falling for the trap of commercialism, you know, a bug in a jug, microbes, put it on the land and all that kind of stuff. He goes out in untouched land around him, untouched, and gets the native microbes and inoculates his soil with the native microbes. Now, there's another article in there, and that's the best to do, is you want everything native. You want to use your natives because they perform the best. Another guy in there, he hasn't used fertilizers or sprays or anything for 8 to 10 years. He has established a no-till operation of these reductive plants, and he has worked on the genetics of the plants to find species that adapt themselves to his environment and his growing conditions. And as a result of increasing the health via the crops that he's growing, feeding the microbes that not only fertilize the plant but impart disease resistance and insect pest resistance. He has worked on the genetics of the plants by selecting certain genes from old varieties and planted them in his ground. Now, as part of the operation, and we'll learn more about it as I talk on some of the talks I'm going to give, animals are part of God's design. Cain, vegetables, Abel, herder. I gave you an example of what herding does and how it repairs the soil. They have a role to play. Now, so he has cattle on his ground too. Now, he used to have to use ivermectin, you know, because his cattle will get sick. But now his cattle aren't getting sick. And, you know, it could be end of story. They're just healthy. But the reality is this. Ivermectin comes from a soil microbe. He has set up a system where he's producing his own ivermectin. And so, because we're supposed to have fungus in our diet, you have no choice if it's grown God's way to be eating fungus every time you eat food. Because you have fungus entering the plant and they're controlling operations in the plant. Dr. Joel Furman, his suggestion to people is you got to have mushrooms in your diet every day. A teaspoon. You want about a teaspoon or so. And the reason is because most people are eating from commercial land that's been used, that they use fungicides on. And nematicides and other things that kill off the biological life in the soil so you don't have the mycorrhizal fungi. The other guy that I told you who was repairing his soil there, he got old varieties to grow because the old varieties were growing in soils utilizing the fungus in the soil. And so he wanted those old varieties because his soil operates wonderfully with God's design. So they asked him, they said, look, you know, you got a different operation here. The seed company did, and said, can we grow some of our seed as a test plot on it? Yeah, I guess so, but I want you to get me some of the old varieties of soy. So they come that spring, call him one day and say, we're going to come tomorrow and put them in. And he says, do you got the old varieties? Oh no, we've got the best 8 of the most modern varieties today that do the best. They put those 8 in. They did horribly. They did horribly. So he ended up having to go to the seed bank, the U.S. seed bank, pay $2 a seed, and they'll only give you 50 of the old varieties. And he put them in, and they really performed wonderfully, better than the soybeans he used to have, because they're adapted to God's design. And he was recreating God's design. But the thing that I contemplated was that, why did the cattle not need the ivermectin anymore? And we say because they're healthy. But ivermectin is not an unhealthy organism. It's a soil-borne organism. Fenbendazole, I'm told, also is this. And so we have nations like India during the COVID outbreak that were telling their people, use ivermectin. Okay, and we have, I started keeping a list of all these things that get rid of COVID. COVID is so easy to get rid of and prevent. We had Indonesia telling everybody lemongrass. It has a mycorrhizal symbiotic relationship that feeds microbes that are going to destroy, the COVID microbe. You got in the American tropics, Circe, or Africa, Circe. People use that. And you got here, Trump gets up there and he says, when Fauci's talking, he says, well, you can use hydrochloroquine. He says it in a low tone, like, who am I? I'm not a doctor, but you can use hydrochloroquine. But he says it so people will listen because he knows they'll hear. And hydrochloroquine is good. It'll get rid of malaria too. But what do they use when they have malarial resistance to hydrochloroquine? They use what we here in America call Sweet Annie. It's Artemisia annua, Artemisia absintha annua. And this just wiped COVID out like that, just can't exist. And so we've got plants that support the microbes that make the drugs, we'll call them drugs, what other word are we going to call them, because we all know how to think drugs. And these drugs give the disease resistance to the plant, which give the disease resistance to the cattle, so you don't have to go buy from the pharmacist, okay? And the guy that's doing this, he isn't buying the fertilizers, and he's not buying the sprays, so he's cutting out the oil industry big time. He's just using God's design. He said that he saves approximately, I think he gave about $830,000 a year. He's got 7,000 acres. $830,000 a year because he doesn't use their sprays, doesn't use their fertilizers, and doesn't use their pharmaceuticals. He just uses God's design, and it creates disease resistance and everything. Okay, so that concludes this talk.